We've talked about this some on Wednesday nights in the book of Acts. They were part of the ruling class. They were part of what I would call the upper crust. Terms we might use today, haves and have-nots, they were definitely the haves. They were part of, they had seats on the Sanhedrin court, which was the main court. If I ask any of you, ask some of you to tell me one thing in particular about the Pharisees, is there anything that immediately comes to mind to any of you that would describe maybe the Pharisees? Holier than thou. What I wrote down, one of the things, they were very legalistic. If you know what that means. They followed the law, what they believed to be God's law, to the nth degree. In fact, and I didn't have this scripture written down, so I'm going to flip to it real quick. In Matthew 23, verse 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You pay tithes of mint, dill, and cumin, but you have disregarded the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." Jesus calls them out in Matthew, says, look, you take tithing, again, to the nth degree, you take tithing so seriously, you tithe a tenth of your spices that you have. You tithe a tenth of the littlest grains of stuff that you have. But Jesus also says there that you miss the weightier or the more important matters of the law. You know, a lot of their laws were oral. We've talked before, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 commands, 600 laws that the Jews had at that point. And the Pharisees a lot of times were lawyers or scribes that had knowledge of the law. They could draw up legal documents. Again, like today, we have people that can do that. Now, a lawyer and a scribe might be two different sets of groups, but they might also be the same group. And Jesus talks about both. And if you read through the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, throughout the first 10 chapters of Luke, over and over and over again, they question Jesus. They test him. They question him. In chapter 5, Jesus heals a paralytic. And in that story, and we're not going to read the whole story, but in that story, the paralytic comes to Jesus to be healed, and the first thing Jesus says is that he forgives him of his sins. And then when tested further, he heals him, says arise and walk, and he does. But when Jesus tells him that he's forgiven of his sins, do you know what the Pharisees say? Who is he that he forgives sins? Later on in chapter 5, he sat down and ate with tax collectors. You know what the Pharisees had to say about that? He's trying to convert them. He's trying to help them. That's not what they said. They said, who is he that he eats with and drinks with sinners and tax collectors? So throughout their questioning, Jesus, chapter 6, same thing. Chapter 6, Jesus' disciples, they're hungry. They go through the wheat field and get handfuls of wheat. Pharisees, why are you doing what is not lawful? Well, again, that was a law, a command they had made up based on the original teachings. In that chapter, in chapter 6, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand, and it said that it made the Pharisees furious. They're mad that he healed somebody. Can you guys imagine? They're mad that he healed somebody. Do we get mad at our doctors when they help make us better? We get mad maybe sometimes if they don't make us better. Then chapter 7, real quickly. Jesus goes and eats with one of the Pharisees, and the woman washes his feet. Neil talked about this in a lesson last Sunday, a couple of Sundays ago. What kind of woman was she? Most likely. We talked about this. Neil mentioned it. Most likely she was a prostitute. And their question there was, does he not know what kind of woman she is? Does he not know what she does? They also, in verse 30 of chapter 7, they complained about what John the Baptist would do. So I say all this fairly quickly. They were opposed to Jesus. They were speaking out against Jesus. They were grumbling about Jesus practically from day one. So again, why don't we want to be a Pharisee? We'll flip over to Luke chapter 11. Luke chapter 11, and I'm going to read very quickly verses 37 through 54, and that's a bit of a read, but we'll get through it. Luke chapter 11, verses 37 through 54. While Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and reclined at the table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools! Did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. But woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Woe to you Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it." One of the lawyers answered him, "Teacher, in saying these things, you insult us also." And he said, "Woe to you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourself do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. So you are witness, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. Woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering." And he went away from there. The scribes and the Pharisees began to press him hard and to provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him to catch him in something that he might say. So, in Luke's account of this, some of which matches back to what I read in Matthew a minute ago, Jesus there in verse 40, verse 39, he starts off, "You fools." Chase is preaching today. If Chase gets up here when he starts his sermon, and the first thing he looks out at us and says, "You fools," how are we going to feel about that? That would be pretty tough. But again, Jesus just called them out. He says, "You fools, you're worried about the outside." He didn't wash his hands. What started this? Jesus didn't wash his hands. They had this ritual washing that they did before a meal. And Jesus didn't do that. Well, my first question there is, if Jesus didn't do this ritual washing that they had come up with over the years, that they thought was a law, a command at that point, was that ritual washing really from God? Was ritual washing really something God expected them to do? If Jesus didn't do it, obviously it's not what God expected them to do. But they worried about how it looked. You know, well, you came in, you just sat down at the table. You didn't wash your hands. You didn't do this ceremonial washing. They were worried about how it looked. And along talking about that, go down to verse 43 that I read a second ago. Woe to you, for you love the best seat in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. We're going to hear you fools or woe to you about 6 or 7 times in this. Again, they wanted to look good. They wanted to make sure people saw them following the law. When we want to look good, and I don't have to ask for a show of hands, you can raise your hand if you want to. Do we like to look good? I have to work really hard to look good, and I'm not sure that I ever accomplished that. But I don't want to come up here and have on an old ragged shirt and have on old ragged pants and my hair not be done and not have taken a shower in 2 or 3 years. When I stand before people, I want to look as good as I can look. Now again, a lot of people here can look a lot better than I can. I'm limited by what I got to work with. But we want to look as good as we can. We want to be, term I heard growing up, we want to be presentable. We want to look as good as we can look. They wanted to look good. They were worried about men. They were worried about making other people happy. They wanted the best seat. They wanted to be seen. Some of my family and some of my friends, they give me a hard time. Terry's not in here. Terry's one of the best at it. Terry's comment is, for me, and for those of you that don't know, I'm a county commissioner here, but Terry's comment is, you never put a politician behind a microphone or in front of a camera. Some of us crave that spotlight, so to speak. They wanted to be seen. They wanted that spotlight on them. And Jesus very rightly tells them, here in verse 41, I'm going to read it again. But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. Jesus says, if you focus on the inside, if you look good on the inside, if you're doing the right things on the inside, you will be clean. Everything else will take care of itself. It doesn't matter what we do externally if our heart's not in the right place, if our heart's not in it. Proverbs 4:23, in fact, says, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. The writer of Proverbs says that eternal life comes from the heart. May need some tech support over here. Not only that, 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7 says, but the Lord said to Samuel, when he was talking about who was going to be king, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Man, we get caught up on the outward appearance. God knows what's in our heart. When we talk about outward appearance, and again, Tina's in Christian Cove teaching. Tina didn't marry me for my looks. If she did, bless her heart, we need to check her eyesight. When we find boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, certainly their physical attractiveness makes a difference. But that pretty's going to wear off someday. You need to marry somebody that's pretty on the inside. You need to be with somebody that's pretty on the inside. What we look like, as I'm finding out, we get older, we just look like we're getting older, and that's what we got. So what's on the inside matters. That's the first woe. Verse 42. Woe to you, Pharisees, you tithe mint and rue and every herb, and neglect the justice and the love of God. Well, I talked about kind of at the beginning the same verse in Matthew They went to the extreme, paying their tithes, but they neglected what Jesus here calls the simplest duties, the simplest things that we should do towards God and towards our neighbors. What's Jesus talking about there? What's the greatest command? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. We've talked a lot about this, again, in the young marrieds class or whatever we call that class. If you love God, truly, you love God, and your actions will show that, and you love your neighbor, and your actions will show that, all the rest of this stuff kind of takes care of itself. And that's what God's telling them, or what Jesus is telling them here. Yeah, you guys are really good at counting out the seeds of your spices, but do you really love God? Do you really love your neighbors? Is what you're doing every day externally show that? You know, they were too busy, they were too focused on the minutia. We flip back a chapter, Luke 10, verses 25 through 37, and I'm not going to read that. But Luke 10, verses 25 through 37 is the parable of the Good Samaritan. In that starts with one of the lawyers asking Jesus a question. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he asked the question. And what's Jesus say back to him? Well, how do you read the law? What do you think it says? The lawyer knew. He knew the answer. Because he repeats to Jesus, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and love your neighbors. And what was Jesus', and then he asked Jesus, okay, so who's my neighbor? And that's where Jesus goes into the parable. But my point here is, the lawyer knew the right answer. He knew the right answer, and I'm going to go as far as to say most of the Pharisees probably knew the right answer to that. They didn't know how to put it in action. They didn't know how to live it. We can know the right answer to things, but not know how to put it in action. We've got to be careful about that. Our next woe, verse 44. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing them. Listen, I did a lesson a few years ago, and a big part of the lesson was the difference in how Jesus talked to the Pharisees, the religious elites of the time, versus how he talked to the sinners or how he treated the sinners and the tax collectors and the prostitutes. Jesus is hard on the Pharisees. Again, we see it here, and there's a lot of other places. There's these woe sentences, calls them a brood of vipers, a lot of other things. But he says, you're like unmarked graves, and people walk over you. Again, I've been called a lot of things in my life. I've never been called an unmarked grave, and I wouldn't take that as a compliment. He didn't pull any punches. They knew better. And that's right. And along those lines, again, you go back to Matthew 23, two different accounts of the same thing. Matthew 23, 27 and 28. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanliness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Again, those two kind of parallel. A whitewashed tomb. Now again, we don't, nowadays we don't have tombs, but we still have a lot of tombstones. Or again, you're old school like me, people call it just a rock. Sometimes it's interesting. I actually went by the cemetery the other day where most of my immediate Cassidy family is buried, and one of my uncles, his gravestone, it's getting a little moss on it. It's getting a little, I don't know, a little dirt stuff on it. And I thought, okay, well, we're going to have to bring a brush over here and we're going to have to clean this up. We want these memorials to our families. We want them to look good. We don't want them to be overgrown and look bad. That's what Jesus is saying about them. Again, you guys want to look good on the outside. You want to look like you're righteous on the outside. But inwardly, you're full of ungodly thoughts, you're full of ungodly feelings, and you're full of wickedness. Internally, and therefore eternally, you're nothing but dead men's bones. Again, that's harsh. As you said, Diana, Jesus just gave it to them straight, but I don't think I'd feel good if somebody called me dead men's bones. It is more so today. Again, we don't have as much. It's a mausoleum. It's an above ground burial place as opposed to below ground. And again, some of the cemeteries here and some places there are some mausoleums, and you go look at them. Oh, they're marble and they're beautiful. What's on the inside's dead bodies. It's dead. Verse 46, our next woe. Verse 46, woe to you lawyers also. Again, right before this, one of the lawyers says, Jesus, maybe you hadn't figured this out, but you're kind of talking rough to us. You're kind of being insulting to us. And to Diana's point again, he kind of doubles down. He's like, yeah, I'm talking rough to you. But verse 46, you load people with burdens that are hard to bear. You yourself do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers. So they were requiring others to observe very difficult religious ceremonies. I've taught a class before on when Jesus overturns the money changers' tables at the temple, and the whole setup. At this time, that was a racket. People came to Jerusalem to make their offering, and most people couldn't afford to or couldn't bring all the animals that they needed to bring. So guess what? Just so happens there's somebody set up in the temple's outer courtyard that would sell you what you needed for your offering. But oh, by the way, they're charging too much money, and oh, by the way, if you actually had to swap the money you had with the temple money that they would accept, you were paying an exorbitant exchange fee. And it wasn't Jews necessarily that did these things, but the people that did it had the approval of the high priest, had the approval of the Jews in charge. So again, at the end of the day, it was a racket, and that's the reason Jesus was upset about that. So they were doing that and a lot of other things. They were making these rules, these requirements very difficult, while they, as Jesus has said over and over, they were neglecting some of this stuff. Basically, they had one set of rules for the common people, and they had another set of rules for themselves. Does that sound familiar? Do any, and again, I'm not looking for a show of hands, and we're not going to start talking politics. Does anybody ever feel like that the government has one set of rules for most of us and a separate set of rules for congressmen and senators? And, 2,000 years later, things hadn't changed a whole lot. One set of rules for everybody. We need to make sure that we all follow the same standard and that we point people towards the same standard. Interestingly enough, in Acts chapter 15, and that's the chapter of the Jerusalem Council, where they get together and they talk about circumcision for the first time related to the Gentiles. And again, we've been going through Acts on Wednesday nights. But Acts chapter 15, when they have this discussion, It's interesting. At one point, Peter stands up and addresses the people that are gathered. And here's what he says in verse 10 there. Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? Peter recognizes in the discussion about circumcision exactly what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees here. You're putting rules on people. You're trying to put requirements on people that you can't follow. Now, Peter went a little further and said, not only have we not been able to follow it, our fathers and our grandfathers, nobody could follow this. One other thing about this, thought that there were rules that they put on the people that were very hard, very difficult. And again, they were the religious leaders. They were the ones that knew what the rules were. One of the great things that has changed in 2,000 years, I don't know, there's 50, 75 of us in here right now. Everybody in here either has a Bible laying in their lap, on their phone app. Everybody in here's got a Bible. If I say something off or a little crazy or misspeak, there's 75 of y'all that in about 3 seconds can look it up and say, hey, wait a minute, Chris, I don't think that's what it says, or you read that wrong. 2,000 years ago, when the Pharisees or when the other religious leaders got up and spoke, the common folk, the people out in the crowd, they just had to take them at what they said because they couldn't proof text. They couldn't study for themselves. And Paul even says in the book of Philippians 4, verse 9, again, he's encouraging them. What you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Paul's not saying, hey, I have told you one thing, but I'm doing another. I've told you to do one thing, you're going to see me doing another. Paul said, what you've learned from me, what you've received from me, what you've heard from me, and what you've seen me do. Those are the things that you're supposed to do. And the Pharisees didn't live that way. They very much were not a do as I do, not as I say. They were very much a do as I say, not as I do. We've got another woe statement in verse 47. Verse 47, woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed. And the verse is going through. But Jesus' whole point is, at this time, the Jews, and again the religious leaders, they made a big deal. Well, this is what the prophets taught. This is what the prophets have shown us how to do this. This is what the prophets said. But they were living the same way and doing the same things that the prophets had condemned in the Old Testament. They were neglecting the teachings of the prophets. They were putting them aside. Again, if we had read on down there again, Jesus says that your fathers killed the prophets. But they were neglecting all of that. But outwardly, they were paying respect to them. We've put this memorial up to honor Elijah or Elisha or whichever prophet, but they didn't respect them. They didn't pay attention to them. And again, we talked about a lot about a year ago. We were going through Genesis on Wednesday night. And so often in that discussion, in that study, I would make the comment, this happened in Genesis 6,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, whatever the time frame was. Things hadn't changed much. Well, things hadn't changed much. You go back, you look at the book of Jeremiah, which is a great book, and we studied Jeremiah a couple of years ago. Throughout the whole book of Jeremiah, again, one of the prophets, he keeps telling them, he keeps telling the Israelites, God says, if y'all don't straighten up, you're going to go into captivity in Babylon. If you do straighten up, I'm going to bless you. But if you don't, and God knew they weren't going to, you're going to have to go to Babylon. Well, guess what? They didn't straighten up. Guess what? They went to Babylon for 70 years. It's no different today. God offers us two choices. We can follow Him. We can do what He's told us to do. We can live the life that we're supposed to live, and we're going to be blessed. Or we cannot do that. We cannot do what God's taught us. We cannot do what we know to be right. Instead of going to Babylon, we'll go to Hades at some point, and we'll be eternally lost. Last woe, verse 52. Woe to you lawyers, for you've taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who were entering. What Jesus is saying there, you guys have the knowledge. You guys have the understanding, or you should have the understanding. But not only are you not acting on it in a right way, by the way you're teaching it, by the way you're requiring these difficult ceremonies and these things that are hard to do, you're actually keeping other people from eternal life. You're actually keeping other people from doing the things they need to do. They intentionally made the law hard to understand. If I'm the only one that understands the law, who have you guys got to come ask anytime you're not sure about the law? If I'm the only expert in the place, and can't think of a specific example with one of us, if we're the only expert, then they got to rely on us. I will give a quick. I retired, quote unquote, December 31st of last year. That's nearly a year ago, which is amazing to think about. I have spent at least one day at my old office practically every week this year, sometimes 2 days. You know why? There's stuff for 27 years. I was the only one that did it. I was the only one that knew how to do it. So now when those things come up, and some of those things only come up once or maybe twice a year, God's taken my job. He's a great guy. He's doing a great job. But it's, okay, hey, Chris, this has come up. How do I do this? If you're the only one with the knowledge, you've got a lot of power. And that's what the Pharisees wanted. They wanted that power. Truthfully, it's one of the biggest reasons I think that they rejected Jesus. What Jesus is teaching here with this last woe, we're not only responsible for our actions, but we're responsible for the actions of others if they're following something we taught them and we taught them incorrectly. We're responsible for how our actions affect other people. Our time is about up. Again, this is just one example of many of the Pharisees and how they had gotten off the rails a little bit. Again, they were supposed to be the religious experts. And in the religious world today, truthfully, sometimes the Church of Christ is called Pharisaical. Because maybe sometimes we get too hung up on one specific rule or one specific command. I don't want to be a Pharisee. Go back to the VBS song. I hope I'm not. I hope we're not. We don't need 600 rules. The law's not difficult to understand. What we need to do is we need to love God with everything we have, and we need to love our neighbors. Let's have a quick word of prayer, and class will be over.